The story begins in a quiet coastal region called Virella, a place where the sea is not just part of life, but part of memory. Old fishermen still work the harbor, and deep-sea divers like Victor Hale are respected more than officials or scientists because they understand something others often forget. The ocean does not give answers easily, and it never gives them for free. Victor Hale is 62 years old. He has spent most of his life underwater, working in conditions where pressure replaces noise and visibility is always uncertain. He is not a researcher in the academic sense, but he has recovered more wrecks and inspected more submerged structures than most university teams combined. His experience is physical, not theoretical. He works with a small crew of trusted divers. Marco Ruiz handles equipment and underwater systems. Elias Novak specializes in structural analysis during dives. John Carter is responsible for navigation and recording data. All of them are experienced men who have stayed in the profession long after others retired, not because it was easy, but because they never fully adapted to life on land. For years, their work in Virella was routine. They inspected harbor foundations, checked underwater pipelines after storms, and occasionally assisted in small recovery operations when fishing boats lost cargo. Nothing about their work was unusual or historically significant. It was steady, predictable, and local. That changed when a private marine survey team passed through the region during a coastal mapping operation. Their sonar equipment detected something unusual at a depth of approximately 80 meters. The shape was large, structured, and unusually symmetrical. It did not match natural geological formations, nor did it resemble any recorded shipwreck in the region. The survey team did not investigate further. They labeled it as an unidentified submerged structure and moved on, focusing on their original assignment. However, a copy of the sonar data eventually reached the local harbor authority, and from there it was forwarded to experienced personnel for interpretation. That is how Victor Hale became involved. When Victor first reviewed the sonar images, he did not speak immediately. He simply studied them in silence. The lines were too clean, too deliberate. Nature rarely produces symmetry at that scale underwater. His experience told him this was not random debris or rock formation. Something had been placed there, or something had changed the seabed in a controlled way long ago. The decision to investigate was not made by officials at first, but by experience itself. Victor told his crew they would dive. No public announcement was made. No external team was invited. It would be a controlled descent, early morning, standard deep-sea procedure for unknown targets. The morning of the dive was calm. The sea surface near Virella looked almost peaceful, as if nothing unusual existed beneath it. The crew prepared their equipment carefully. Heavy diving suits, oxygen systems, communication lines, and recording tools were checked multiple times. In deep diving, mistakes are not corrected later. As they moved offshore, there was little conversation. Everyone understood the importance of focus. Victor stood at the edge of the boat for a long time before the descent, looking at the water without speaking. When Elias asked if he believed the object was significant, Victor only said that it was something that did not belong where it was found. The descent began slowly. At first, everything was familiar: temperature drop, gradual loss of light, controlled breathing, and stable communication. But as they passed deeper than 70 meters, the environment changed. Visibility reduced, and the seabed became more difficult to interpret. At around 80 meters, the structure appeared. It was partially buried in sediment, but clearly artificial. A large hull-like formation extended across the seabed, reinforced with sections of wood and metal. It was not a modern construction, but it was also not a random wreck. The geometry suggested intention, planning, and engineering. Marco was the first to approach it closely. His light revealed aligned structural segments that resembled a hull but did not match any known vessel design. Elias began documenting the formation, noting that parts of it appeared layered, as if multiple structural phases existed beneath the visible surface. John recorded everything carefully. while Victor moved slowly along the perimeter. The structure was too large to understand from a single angle. It seemed partially collapsed into the seabed, as if it had settled gradually over a very long period rather than sinking in a single event. Then they found metal, a plate embedded within the structure, heavily corroded but still intact enough to show engraved markings. Elias carefully cleared the sediment, revealing partial symbols and fragmented text. At first, it did not match any known registry system. It was neither modern naval classification nor standard historical ship identification. But then a name became visible: Aurora. The atmosphere changed immediately, not because the name itself was familiar, but because it appeared in older maritime references that were rarely discussed outside specialized archives. Victor recognized that this was no ordinary wreck. It was something that had been recorded in fragments of history but never fully explained. He made a decision: no further disturbance. The team would document the structure and leave it intact. Disturbing it could destroy historical context that might never be recovered again. They marked the location and began their ascent. As they rose through the water, silence followed them. Not because there was nothing to say, but because everyone understood that what they had seen was only the beginning of something much larger than a routine dive. When they finally returned to the surface, the world above felt normal, but none of them felt the same. The sea behind them no longer represented routine work. It now represented something unknown, waiting, and unfinished. Back in Virella, the return from the dive did not feel like a conclusion. It felt like the start of something that had already moved beyond their control. Victor Hale knew this feeling well. It usually appeared when an underwater discovery stopped being a private observation and became something others wanted to own, classify, or erase. The footage from the dive was reviewed the same day. Marco, Elias, and John gathered in a small equipment room near the harbor, replaying sonar overlays and video recordings frame by frame. The structure was still difficult to understand, even on land. Underwater, it had felt massive and real. On screen, it felt even more unnatural. Elias pointed out the layered construction again. It was not a single wreck. It looked like multiple phases of reinforcement, as if something had been repaired or modified over time while still underwater. That detail made no sense in modern terms. No known salvage operation would have worked at that depth and scale without documentation. John highlighted the engraved markings they had found. Even enhanced, they remained partially unreadable. But the fragment containing the name Aurora was clear enough to create concern rather than clarity. Victor did not comment immediately. He simply watched the paused frame for a long time. By evening, the first outside contact arrived. A vehicle from the Regional Maritime Authority entered Virella Harbor without announcement. Two men in formal inspection clothing requested access to all recorded data. They did not introduce themselves beyond credentials. Their tone was polite but firm in a way that made refusal difficult. Victor understood immediately what was happening. This was no longer a private dive. The data was handed over under supervision. Copies were requested, then confirmed. The officials did not ask many questions about interpretation. They were more interested in controlling information flow than understanding the structure itself. Before leaving, one of them made a simple statement: the site was now under review. Further dives would require authorization. That evening, the mood in the crew shifted. Marco called it what it was: restriction without explanation. Elias suggested that something about the structure had triggered administrative attention faster than expected. John, who usually avoided speculation, said nothing at all. Victor left the harbor alone and walked along the coastline. He had seen this pattern before in different forms. When something underwater could not be easily categorized, it often attracted two reactions: silence or control. Silence meant neglect. Control meant importance. This was not neglect. 2 days later, a researcher arrived. Her name was Dr. Helena Marsh, an independent marine archaeologist with experience in submerged pre-industrial sites. She was not officially assigned by any institution that she openly declared. She arrived with documents, equipment, and a quiet certainty that suggested she already knew more than she was saying. Helena requested access to Victor's original notes rather than the official copies already submitted. That alone confirmed her seriousness. Official channels rarely asked for raw interpretation. They relied on filtered summaries. She wanted the unfiltered perspective of the diver who first saw the structure. When Victor met her, she did not waste time on introductions. She asked one question: how stable was the structure during the dive? Victor answered honestly, stable but layered, not collapsed suddenly, settled over time. Helena nodded as if this confirmed something she already suspected. She explained that there were old maritime references to an object or vessel named AURORA that appeared inconsistently across different archives. Some described it as a research vessel, others as a failed experimental transport project. Most references were incomplete or deliberately redacted. What made her interested was not the name itself, but the pattern of disappearance. Every reference ended the same way: without recovery, without confirmed wreckage, and without official conclusion. The structure in Virella matched none of the documented coordinates, yet the design fragments suggested a vessel far larger and more complex than typical ships of its supposed era. That evening, Victor returned to the crew and shared what he had learned. The reaction was mixed. Marco was skeptical of archival theories. Elias was intrigued by the idea of layered construction matching unknown retrofitting phases. John remained cautious, noting that official attention usually meant restricted access soon followed. He was right. The next morning, access to the dive zone was formally restricted. A temporary exclusion perimeter was declared under maritime safety regulations. No additional explanation was provided. At the same time, external vessels began appearing offshore. Survey ships, observation craft, equipment platforms that were not part of local operations. Virella, usually quiet and predictable, started to feel monitored. Victor noticed something else. The structure had not been publicly identified, yet it was being treated as if it already had strategic importance. That was the moment he understood the truth. They were not reacting to what had been found. They were reacting to what it might reveal, and somewhere beneath 80 meters of water, Aurora was no longer just a name on corroded metal. It had become a problem that different people wanted to control before it could be understood. The restriction did not stop Victor Hale. It only changed the way he moved. In Virella, official control rarely meant absolute control. It meant delay, paperwork, and observation. The sea itself could not be fenced in, only monitored. Victor understood that if they wanted answers, they would have to return to the structure before external forces decided what was allowed to be known. The decision for a second dive was not announced. It was made quietly in the same equipment room where the first footage had been reviewed. Marco, Elias, and John did not argue. They all understood the risk. What they did not agree on was what they were actually dealing with. Dr. Helena Marsh returned the same morning, as if she had expected this decision. She did not try to stop them. Instead, she asked to join the dive. That request immediately changed the dynamic of the crew. Victor hesitated. Adding a civilian archaeologist to an unauthorized deep dive increased risk, but Helena's knowledge of submerged historical anomalies made her more useful than most official support teams. He agreed under one condition. She followed instructions without deviation. The second descent began at dawn, earlier than the first. The sea was less calm this time. Small surface currents suggested changing weather, but conditions below 80 meters would remain unaffected. At least that was the assumption. They entered the water without official clearance. No external support vessels were nearby, but Victor knew that would not last long. Someone was watching the area. He could feel it in the timing of patrol movements. At depth, the structure was still there, but it had changed. Not physically. Structurally, it appeared identical to the first dive. But the sediment around it looked disturbed in a way that had not been recorded previously. Fine layers of seabed material had shifted, revealing additional metallic sections beneath the main visible frame. Elias noticed it first. There were deeper layers. The structure was not a single hull. It was built over something older. Helena immediately requested a closer inspection of the lower segments. Her breathing pattern changed slightly, controlled excitement mixed with caution. Victor allowed it, but kept the team tightly grouped. As they descended along the side of the structure, visibility decreased. Light became weaker, absorbed by suspended particles in the water. At approximately 90 meters, they found something new, a second layer. It was not part of the ship they had originally identified. It was something embedded beneath it. A reinforced frame, older in design with completely different construction materials. The geometry was inconsistent with known maritime engineering from any documented era. Marco touched it and immediately pulled back his hand. The surface was colder than expected, almost unnaturally stable, as if it had not interacted with water temperature in the same way as surrounding materials. Helena began recording measurements. Her voice over comms was controlled but noticeably more intense. "This is not a ship resting on the seabed," she said. "This is a structure built into it." That statement changed everything. John, still focused on navigation data, noticed something else. The sonar reflection pattern was inconsistent with a single object. It suggested multiple internal voids, as if the structure contained compartments or hidden layers. Victor moved slowly along the edge until he found another marking. This one was deeper, more intact than the first. Again the name appeared, AURORA. But this time it was not alone. There were additional markings nearby, partially obscured but repeating in a structured pattern. Not random inscriptions, sequenced identifiers. Helena reacted immediately. She adjusted her light angle and began cleaning sediment from a larger section. What appeared was not decoration, it was classification. Lines of coded structure embedded into the hull-like material, suggesting systematic documentation of something built to be recorded, not forgotten. Then the comm signal briefly distorted. At first, it was assumed to be interference from depth pressure, but John confirmed that surface equipment was stable. The distortion came from below. A low-frequency vibration moved through the structure, not strong enough to damage equipment, but distinct enough to be felt through the diving suits. Marco signaled to ascend. Victor agreed immediately. They were no longer in a simple discovery phase. Something about the structure was active or reacting to their presence. During ascent, Helena remained silent for almost the entire climb. Only when they reached safer depth did she finally speak. "This is not a wreck," she said. "It never was." Back on the surface, the atmosphere was different again. The second dive had taken less time, but it carried far more weight. The crew did not speak until they were back on the vessel. When they finally reviewed the partial data, Helena made a statement that shifted the entire direction of the investigation. "Aurora was not lost at sea," she said. "It was placed there." No one responded immediately, because that idea introduced a new category of possibility, one that did not belong to accidents, storms, or historical failure. It belonged to intention, and intention meant someone had known exactly where it would end up. By the third day, Virella no longer felt like a quiet coastal town. The presence of external vessels had increased. What started as 2 survey ships had turned into a rotating perimeter of monitoring craft positioned just outside the dive zone. None of them officially declared intent, but their movements followed the structure's location with precision that could not be accidental. Victor Hale understood what this meant. The discovery was no longer purely scientific. It was now operational. Dr. Helena Marsh spent most of her time analyzing the data from the second dive. The deeper layer they had found beneath Aurora changed her entire interpretation. She stopped referring to it as a shipwreck and began calling it a constructed marine system, though she refused to define what that system was built for. Marco and Elias focused on equipment calibration for a possible third descent. John tracked surface activity patterns. The conclusion was simple but uncomfortable. They were being observed but not yet stopped. That changed when the Harbor Authority issued a new directive. All diving operations within a defined radius were suspended pending environmental hazard assessment. No mention of the structure was made directly, but the coordinates matched exactly. The crew understood the message immediately. They were being locked out. Helena reacted first. She argued that suspension made no scientific sense. The reading showed no biological hazard, no chemical leakage, no structural instability affecting navigation. The restriction was not safety-based, it was control-based. That evening, Victor received a private communication from an unknown channel. It was not an official message, but a request, a meeting, offshore, no documentation, no recording devices. Helena insisted it was a trap. Marco suggested ignoring it. John pointed out that ignoring it would not stop escalation. Victor made the decision to go. The meeting took place on a neutral vessel anchored beyond territorial enforcement range. Two individuals were present, neither introduced themselves by name. Their communication was precise, minimal, and carefully structured. They asked Victor one question first. "What exactly did you find?" Victor described the structure without interpretation: layers, metal and wood, non-standard classification markings, the name AURORA. When he finished, there was a long silence. Then one of the individuals said something unexpected. "AURORA is not supposed to exist in recorded seabed data." That sentence confirmed what Helena had suspected. The structure was not just unknown, it was absent from official systems on purpose. They explained nothing further but made an offer. All further exploration would be halted. In exchange, the crew would be compensated and reassigned to standard operations elsewhere. Victor refused. The response was not immediate anger, it was disappointment, as if refusal had been expected but still inconvenient. The meeting ended without resolution. When Victor returned to Virella, the situation had already escalated. Their equipment had been inspected without permission. One of their dive support units had been temporarily disabled. Nothing was officially seized, but access integrity had been compromised. Helena was waiting at the harbor when he returned. She already knew the outcome. "They are not trying to understand it," she said. "They are trying to contain it." That night, the crew gathered in silence. For the first time, there was no discussion of interpretation or theory, only options. Marco suggested leaving Virella entirely. Elias argued that leaving now meant abandoning something significant. John pointed out that they were already past the point of simple retreat. Victor listened to all of them before speaking. "We do one more descent," he said. "Not to explore, to confirm." Helena immediately understood what he meant. Confirmation meant one thing: proof that could not be dismissed or buried. The next morning, they prepared for what would be their most restricted dive yet. Timing was critical. Surface monitoring cycles showed a temporary gap in patrol alignment. They would use it. As they entered the water, Victor noticed something unusual. The seabed around the structure showed subtle changes, not damage, adjustment. As if external forces had already interacted with it while they were on the surface. At 80 meters, the structure appeared again, but this time it was different in one crucial way. A section near the outer frame was open, not destroyed, not collapsed, opened. Helena froze for a moment before signaling the others. The internal layers they had seen before were now partially exposed, revealing a deeper corridor-like formation inside the structure itself. John's recording device captured an anomaly in sonar reflection. The internal space extended farther than any external measurement should allow. "This is impossible," Elias whispered. But Victor did not respond. He was already moving forward. Because whatever AURORA was, it was no longer just beneath them, it was accessible. And something inside it had already changed. The moment Victor Hale crossed the threshold, the water itself felt different. It was not a visual change at first, but a structural one. The currents inside the open section of Aurora moved in a controlled pattern, as if the interior space was not fully submerged in the same way as the outside ocean. Helena noticed it immediately in her instruments, minor pressure inconsistencies that should not exist at that depth. Marco followed closely behind Victor, with Elias and John maintaining position while monitoring the corridor-like opening. The structure was no longer just a wreck or layered hull. It was an interior space shaped with intent, extending deeper than any external geometry suggested. Helena's voice came through comms, low but sharp. "This is not natural displacement. This is engineered volume." No one responded. The corridor inside Aurora was wide enough for multiple divers, reinforced with overlapping metallic ribs and wooden segments fused together in a way that suggested multiple eras of construction. Some parts looked ancient, heavily corroded. Others appeared comparatively preserved, as if sealed away from time. Victor led the way. Their lights revealed markings along the inner walls. Not random corrosion patterns, but structured sequences, repeating symbols, directional lines, and embedded plates with partial inscriptions similar to what they had seen outside. But now there was more, a rhythm to it. Every few meters, the structure repeated a pattern, 3 lines, a gap, then a symbol cluster. Elias began recording it continuously, noting that the repetition suggested either navigation or internal classification. John suddenly stopped. His sonar feed showed something that should not exist in enclosed underwater space, a hollow vertical drop ahead, a shaft, descending deeper into the structure. Helena reacted immediately. She questioned whether they should continue. The deeper they went, the more unstable the system became. But Victor was already analyzing something else. The opening they had entered from was still visible behind them, but it was shrinking, not physically closing like a door, slowly becoming obscured by shifting sediment or internal mechanical adjustment within the structure itself. "That's not normal collapse," Marco said. "That's containment." They had a choice now, but it was not a real choice. Returning might not be possible the same way. Victor made the call. They continued downward. The descent inside the shaft was slow and controlled. The walls were tighter here, more uniform, almost like a tunnel rather than a wrecked structure. The deeper they went, the more the temperature stabilized, which contradicted normal ocean behavior at depth. Helena noted this explicitly. "This system is regulating its internal environment," she said. "It is not passive." At approximately 100 meters inside the structure's internal geometry, they reached a chamber. It was large, far larger than anything that should exist within a submerged object of its externally measured size. The chamber was circular with layered structural rings and a central platform-like formation. In the center was a raised structure, partially covered in sediment and corrosion. Elias moved closer first, clearing debris carefully. What appeared beneath was not machinery. It was a sealed core, metallic, layered, and embedded with repeating inscriptions. But unlike the outer markings, these were more organized, almost like structured data encoded physically into the material. John's sonar suddenly spiked. There was movement, not biological, not fluid, structural. Something within the chamber had activated or responded to their presence. Helena's breathing became audible over comms. "This is not a wreck site," she said again, more firmly this time. "This is a sealed installation." Victor approached the central core. As his light passed over the surface, a final marking became visible beneath sediment layers. Aurora. But now it was not just a name. It was repeated, dozens of times, arranged in circular pattern around the core as if the entire structure was built around the identity itself. Then the sound came, a deep metallic resonance, not transmitted through water like normal vibration but through the structure itself. A low-frequency pulse that traveled through the chamber walls and into their equipment. Marco signaled retreat immediately, but the corridor behind them was no longer clearly visible. The exit had shifted. Helena confirmed it through instruments. The path they had entered through was still there physically, but no longer aligned with their position. The structure is reconfiguring spatial orientation, she said. John's sonar feed went partially blind. Elias stopped recording for a moment, realizing that the system was interfering with external signal integrity. Victor remained focused on the core, because something about it had changed again. A section on its surface had opened slightly, not fully, just enough to suggest that whatever Aurora was designed to protect was no longer completely sealed. And they were now inside the mechanism that kept it contained. Inside the chamber, time stopped feeling linear. The deeper system of Aurora had fully acknowledged their presence. Victor Hale understood this not from theory, but from experience. In all his years of diving, he had never felt a structure respond like a living system. But this was not biological life. It was engineered response, deliberate, structured, and precise. The core in the center of the chamber emitted another low-frequency pulse. This time it was stronger. The vibration traveled through the divers' suits, through the metal frames around them, and into the water itself. Helena's voice was no longer calm. "This is a triggered system. We activated something." Marco immediately turned toward the entrance shaft, but it was no longer stable in sonar readings. The geometry had shifted again. What should have been a direct return path now appeared fragmented, like overlapping layers of corridors existing in different spatial alignments. Elias tried to stabilize the mapping system, but interference increased. John's recording feed flickered, capturing only partial fragments of the chamber at a time. Victor moved closer to the core. The inscriptions around it were now visibly illuminated in faint pulses, synchronized with the system's internal rhythm. It was not random activation. It was structured response, as if the system was running a sequence that had been dormant for a very long time. Helena realized something first. "This isn't reacting to us as intruders," she said. "It's reacting as if we are external confirmation." That statement changed everything, because it suggested Aurora was not defending itself. It was completing a process. The core opened slightly wider. Inside, there was no mechanical engine in the traditional sense. Instead, there were layered structures resembling memory matrices, physical formations arranged in repeating geometric patterns that suggested encoded information rather than simple machinery. John suddenly reported a spike in external sonar interference, but it was not coming from their equipment. It was coming from outside the structure. Something on the surface had initiated communication with Aurora, or Aurora had begun transmitting outward. Helena ordered immediate evacuation. Marco agreed instantly. Elias hesitated only because the data was too important to abandon. But Victor did not move. He was watching the core, because now something had become visible inside it. A sequence of layered inscriptions shifting in a controlled pattern, as if data was being reconstructed after long dormancy, and within that pattern the name appeared again. Aurora. But this time it was followed by coordinates, not geographical, temporal. Helena saw it too. "No," she whispered. "That's not possible." The structure was not just recording identity, it was referencing a cycle, a scheduled reactivation. Marco grabbed Victor's arm and forced a retreat signal. This time Victor complied. They moved back toward the shaft, but the environment had fully changed. The corridor was no longer a fixed passage. It was a shifting system of layered pathways, adjusting in real time as if the structure was reconfiguring itself to control internal access. John lost partial signal entirely. Elias nearly collided with a sealed wall section that had not been there before. Helena stayed focused on one conclusion. "The structure is not a ship," she said. "It's a containment and timing system. Something was placed here and designed to remain dormant until conditions were met." They finally reached what should have been the exit point, but instead of open water, there was a sealed interface layer of sediment and structural plating. The exit had been closed or redirected. Victor placed his hand on the surface, and the system responded. The chamber behind them pulsed once more, stronger than before. The entire structure shifted, not collapsing, reorienting. And for the first time, every diver's instruments synchronized to the same final reading, Aurora status, active. Helena understood the implication instantly. "This was never discovered," she said quietly. "We triggered it." A low mechanical resonance spread through the structure, and somewhere beyond the sealed walls, something began moving that had not moved for a very long time. The dive lights flickered, the water pressure changed, and the system stopped behaving like a wreck. It started behaving like something waking up.